Hey everybody, it's Dave Dugdale, learningvideo.com. So I'm reviewing two lenses from Sony that have the Zeiss branding on them, the 35mm 2.8, and I'm actually filming with the 55 1.8 from Sony. They're the FE native mount for the Sony a7S, a7R, a7 II, a7. So this review is going to be kind of in two parts. So the first part is just me discussing my struggle with the lenses for this particular FE mount for the a7S. If you want to skip this whole first section and go right to the review of these two, don't bother me, just go right here, click on my hand, and it'll take you to where the actual review part starts. So I love shooting stills and video with my a7S and my Panasonic GH4. Great. That's why I don't own a C100 from Canon or a Blackmagic design camera, because they don't shoot stills. I want to have one camera I can take out with me and shoot both video and stills. So the problem I'm having is I came from a Canon background. I came with a lot of my Canon zooms over to the Sony Alpha 7 series of cameras, and I've run into a problem where autofocus is definitely an issue when it comes to taking photographs or stills. So when I put on a Metabones type of adapter, this is actually a photodiox or a Comlight, and I use my Canon lens on the Alpha 7 cameras, the autofocus will happen, but it happens incredibly slow. Like, takes 4 seconds for it to autofocus, and sometimes it doesn't focus accurately at all. So I've pretty much given up on sports photography with the Sony a7S with the native lenses. The continuous autofocus is relatively, I would say, slow compared to my GH4, and the burst rate is pretty much terrible. It's really slow compared to like a 5D Mark III, or even like my GH4 has a much faster burst rate for sports photography. But the images that come off the a7S, even at 12 megapixels for stills, are wonderful, and I'd love to have a really, fast autofocusing lens. And that's kind of where it feels like Sony has kind of let me down, because I'm more of a zoom shooter. I love the fast glass, and it feels like they're limiting me because the only zooms that they're giving us are f4 is wide open as they can go. There's no fast zooms like f2.8 continuous, unfortunately. All right, so let's do a comparison. Right now, I am shooting at f5.6. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to f4 next. So now I'm shooting at f4. For all of Sony's FE native lenses that are zooms, this is as shallow depth of field as you can get, well, in this particular instance. So what I wanna do is let's go to 2.8 to compare it. Okay, right now I am using f2.8, and as you can notice, the background is a bit blurrier than f4. And sometimes I just want to knock the background out of focus more when I'm doing an interview. And if the person's like myself, where they might be talking with their hands, they might be moving around a little bit, but they're not moving in and out a lot like this, where they're going in and out of focus. So I really like having a zoom at 2.8 that, blurs out the background a lot for me. All right, now I'm at f1.8, and this is something I would never do, because you're really taking a risk here if you're doing an interview and you're shooting at f1.8, because if the person moves even just a little bit, they're going to be out of focus, and you notice I'm staying very still. So I'm trying not to be. And since I'm actually filming myself, and I don't even know how to adjust this to the very, very small amount of depth of field that I have, I've actually got this on continuous autofocus. And I notice it works pretty well as long as the person's not waving their hands in front of the camera, and you'll get some breathing going on. Maybe I can actually simulate that if I put my hands up, put them down, put my hands up, put down. Let me see if I can actually see this happening. It's going to my hand, and you're gonna actually see some focus breathing going on. Something you definitely don't want to do in an interview, but since I'm filming it myself, I think this is an interesting way to do it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go back to f4, and you'll notice just how much of the background comes into focus. All right, now I'm back at f4, and you'll notice what the background looks like. So you might be saying, Dave, why don't you just use Metabones, Comlight, photodiox adapter with your Canon glass that you have? And that might be a good idea, but unfortunately, these have reflections in them. And what I want to talk about this really briefly is what happens is the light enters, and it's, the lens is not designed to go through an adapter. It basically bounces around inside this adapter, and you'll get some funky lens flare, or areas that you might even see the lens flare, because this has happened to me on an interview where I'm looking at the person's face and the contrast just went to it just went way down basically, and I'm like, what is going on? And I didn't realize that there was something just out of frame that was a light source that was bouncing around and making her face basically very decontrasty, if that's a word. Now, one of the reasons I don't like these is because of that issue, and I would rather shoot with a native lens where I can shoot stills, have fast autofocus. So a lot of you might be saying, well, you can get some material, I think it's called flocking material, I don't even know the proper term. You can actually glue it inside. I don't even know how you do it, but however you do this, there's two things that can happen. And in the heat of Colorado, if I go outside and I've got this flocking material glued with whatever material I'm gluing it with, I got to think it gets really hot inside this camera with black exterior. The glue, whatever, is going to drip onto my sensor, and my sensor is going to be ruined. Or let's say the flocking material is, has a lot of material in it basically. I don't know if it would or not, but also that stuff might flake off and end up on my sensor. So I really don't want to put anything inside this to create those kind of issues for my sensor, which could definitely ruin a shoot. I'd have to send the camera in. I'd be down for a few weeks with that particular camera. Would not be a good thing. So one of the downsides of these prime native lenses is they don't have image stabilization, which really kind of stinks. I wish they would, but I purchased the 55mm I'm filming myself with right now. That lens is so sharp, and I'll talk about it more in my lens review section. I actually went ahead and bought it, and I bought it kind of on the hope that maybe this summer the a7S II will come out and it'll have the IBIS, the in-body image stabilization. So just to recap, there's disadvantages for both systems. So starting off with the Canon, the disadvantages of using like an adapter with a Canon lens is, like I talked about before, the reflections that you get inside of it. Sometimes not that big of a deal. You don't have any sort of light source just out of the side of the frame or in the frame, not a big deal, but it can be, and it'll rear its ugly head when you don't even realize it. The other thing is, forget sports altogether or any sort of thing like that. If you're doing maybe a fashion shoot or something and you don't mind using focus peaking, yeah, I guess you kind of get away with it there. But autofocus for stills, big disadvantage there. And it's just a heavier lens. It's kind of heavier by, I guess, the amount of what we have right here, because Sony should be able to design 2.8 zoom lenses, for instance, without having this type of weight in between it, because there's no mirror box. So the Canon lenses should be naturally just heavier because of this adapter. So next up, let's talk about the disadvantages of the native FE lenses, just to recap. So one of them is there's no image stabilization, we've talked about before. The other one is it's really, really hard to repeat a focus move if you want to move from one subject to another and you're just doing it by hand, let's say. The reason is because it actually has some sort of weird technology, I think probably in the body, not in the lens, but when you rotate it really quickly, you could travel the whole focus distance basically in a quarter turn. But if you moved really, really slowly, you could pretty much rotate the whole entire way around before you go to your far to close focus distance. So it's really tough. Like on the GH4, we don't really have that. You can kind of do it. It doesn't have that kind of weird thing that's going on. Also Samsung, from my understanding, I've never tested the Samsung camera, but the NX1 has a way to turn this off in the software. You can say, I don't want this to happen. And I went up to the Sony booth and I said, can we do this? And one of the engineers was right there and he was kind of nodding his head like, yeah, we've heard that complaint before. So who knows, maybe they will add that to a new firmware update. The next item is you can't work very fast. Changing out primes, you just can't work very fast. I can zoom in or zoom out like in, I don't know, milliseconds compared to, I don't know, it'd take me, if I'm really fast, maybe a minute to change lenses. And the other downside too is you're going to get your sensor dirty more quickly if you use primes, because obviously if you're in a dusty environment or you're in a bad place where there's dust everywhere or something's going on, you're going to get your sensor dirty quicker. So I asked my friend James Drake, I asked him, if you didn't have like say a 24-70 and you could only shoot on 2 primes, what would it be? And he pretty much shoots on primes all the time anyway. But he came back and he said, a 35 and an 85 for cinematic work, and a 24 and a 50 for documentary or interview type work. Well, we got a 35 and I've got a 55 on the camera right there. So that's covered, but something new came out today, which is very interesting. Zeiss just announced two lenses. The first one looks like around $1,300. It's the 25mm f2, and for $1,200, an 85 1.8. These are native lenses. I'm guessing, I don't know much because I haven't seen the video yet, but just reading the press release, they should have fast autofocus. We don't have to worry about reflection issues, and a lot of other things. And the price, when you compare it to some of the other things, like the 55mm is like $1,000 lens, so these aren't too far off, and they'll be able to, they're maybe better quality. I don't know, because it has the Zeiss branding on them already, these Sony lenses, so we'll definitely have to see. So when I was at the Sony booth at NEB, I also asked them, are you have any relationship with Sigma? Have you ever, talked to them about making some native FE lenses as well, like Zeiss's? And he didn't say much, but he kind of nodded his head a little bit and said, yeah, that sounds like they're maybe working together. So it'd be great if we're getting more options out there, especially if we can get a zoom with image stabilization, like 24-70, 2.8 constant. That would be great from Sigma. All right, if you skipped ahead, you're at the right place. So I'm going to compare the 35mm and the 55mm to my Tamron 24-70 just for kicks. So we just have something to compare it to, because I've been using this lens for years. It's a constant 2.8 zoom. So my first note is that the 55mm is probably the sharpest prime I've ever tested. It's incredibly sharp. At 2.8, even at 1.8, there's very little vignetting when you compare it to the Tamron. This has a lot of vignetting at 2.8. The 55mm just totally crushes this at 2.8 in the center and in the corners for sharpness. There's just no competition. The 55mm wins again at f8, but once you start getting up to about f16 and f22, the Tamron takes over and actually starts winning at f22 in the center and the corners. At f16, the Sony won in the center, but the Sony actually lost in the corners and the Tamron won. Chromatic aberrations. I actually got quite a bit of chromatic aberrations with the Sony compared to the Tamron. I shot at like 2.8 backlit, sun backlit through branches basically is the test I usually do, and the Sony actually lost. The Tamron had less chromatic aberrations there. What's really interesting is this lens is 300 degrees Kelvin warmer than both of the Sony lenses, 35mm and the 50mm. I was really surprised by that. James Drake has always told me that there's definitely color differences between the lenses. I really didn't notice it until now that this lens is that much warmer. And from the test that I've done, basically I would custom white balance, like a white target basically, and all I would do is just change out the lens, and then I would look at, in Lightroom, and then I would line the two up, and sure enough, it was like 300 degrees different, which I was really surprised at. To me, to my eye, I think that the Sony is more accurate. So its color rendition of its glass, the Zeiss glass, is better than the Tamron. That's just my opinion. I don't know if that's right or not. Maybe the Tamron is actually the correct color. All right, next up we're going to talk about the 35mm. It's actually a very similar case to the 55mm compared to the Tamron. It beats it at 2.8. It's sharper in the center and the corners. However, once you get up, like I said before, the exact same thing happened when I got up to like f22. And it was only maybe between f16 and f22 that the Tamron took over and was sharper in the corners than the Sony. The Sony had less barrel distortion than my Tamron. In terms of vignetting, it does have a bit more vignetting than the 55mm. It was, you had to get it about f4 before the vignetting went away. And in terms of autofocus, this was the thing that really bothered me the most, is it kind of, when you put it in continuous autofocus, actually like I am now with this 35mm, in some situations it would actually kind of pulsate, like especially in the corners, and I'll show a demonstration of that here. So like I said before, I purchased the 55mm and I have not purchased this one. I think I'm going to wait to see what happens with there's a new 28mm coming out prime. And I think that will work really well on like a Pilot Fly, a Nebula 4000 Lite, all these pistol grip type of gimbals. So I'm going to wait on before I purchase this one. But I really like having the small lightweight glass for just run a gun or just street shooting photography. It's great. So it leaves me with the question. I've got, my Tamron 24-70. I've got my Canon Monster 7200 2.8, and I've also got the Tokina 16-28. I actually had to look because I don't use it that often. What should I do with these? Should I sell them? Because once, hopefully, I'm kind of crossing my fingers that Sigma will actually enter the market and make some fast 2.8 zooms for the FE mount. And once that happens, I think I'm going to say goodbye to all this expensive glass that I'm not using currently, because like I said before, I really want to get away from these type of adapters where you get reflection issues, slow focus, because again, I like to shoot stills as well as video. So that's pretty much it. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.